Hello again, it's Lock Noob, and today I want to take you through how to take apart, also known as gutting, and reassembling locks. Now, as a lock picker, as a lock hobbyist, one of the main parts of the hobby is being able to take apart a lock and seeing what is on the inside. So here we have a row of key pins, some driver pins and some springs. And if you're part of an online community like Discord, Reddit or other forums, then you may have to prove that you've picked a lock by filming the picking of the lock followed by the gutting of the lock to demonstrate that there's nothing different with the internals of the lock than is normally expected. Before we can disassemble or gut a lock, first of all we have to be able to free the plug, the bit that turns, from the body or housing of the lock. Now, there are many different mechanisms that locks employ to stop the plug from being accidentally pulled out with the key, and circlips, as you can see here, are one of the most common. But I have a range of some other common mechanisms that we can talk about how to remove that stop the plugs from being pulled out of the body of the lock by accident. There are many tools available to help us free the plugs, and I've got a range of them here. I'll try to leave some non-sponsored links in the description below. We have circlip removers, we have circlip pliers, and some trusty old screwdrivers. First up we have an E-clip because it looks a bit like an E, and these often need to be just pulled off because of the tabs on the inside. So you just pull these like that and they should remove. So you need a tool that looks a little bit like this. This is actually a multi-purpose tool that I developed with Sparrow's lockpicks, and if you're lucky those E-clips can be pushed off using the other end as well, as long as they're not too tight. This is another variant of an E-clip which is quite common, and you definitely can't just push these off using a tool like this. But with the right tool you may be able to just expand that E-clip out enough to be able to get the clip off the lock like this. For removing circlips in double Euros like this, I would definitely recommend you getting some gutting tools like this. This is the Sparrow's gut wrench, and this one is from the HUK lock disassembly kit, something which I recommend all brand new pickers to get, not sponsored. So here we use the tool to just push out the circlip like that, and it comes away quite easily. For common key in knob cylinders, there is a little pin which just needs to be pushed down so you can rotate the collar around and round until this comes off. It just screws off, and that pin is a retaining pin. Some locks will have screws on the back, quite often a Phillips or Japanese style screw head. This lock actually has star-shaped screw heads, so you need a screwdriver which will fit that. It's rare to find this variant of a spring clip or circlip. That can be removed with a special tool like this, these pliers, and they just go into the holes and they will expand that out until that can come off. And it's worth mentioning padlocks like this where you will need to use a screwdriver to remove a screw in the top of the lock to release the anti-drill / pull plate. That will allow you to slide out the core, and from there we can use a circlip remover to gently push off the circlip. So you use the smaller one and you can just push that off like that. The next question is, do you want to gut the lock from the front or from the rear? It is much easier to gut a lock from the rear, and in some ways safer too, because you can use shims. I will come on to those later. If you picked a double Eurocylinder style lock like this and you want to gut it, then I would definitely recommend going in from the front, not trying to go in from the rear, because that gets incredibly complicated. So let's start with the rear disassembly. So the first thing we'll have done is we'll have removed the circlip at the back of the lock, and that will allow us to free the plug from the body. And it's probably just worth making clear that to gut or disassemble any lock, the lock needs to be open, either because you picked the lock or because you actually have the key. If you do not have the lock open, you can't slide the plug out from the lock body, because the driver pins will be doing what they're supposed to do in a lock, which is keeping the lock locked. If we were to just pull this plug out now, we'd have a terrible accident and mess. because what would happen is there's nothing stopping the driver pins and springs from all falling out of the lock, and if you're not careful you can end up really badly damaging the pins and springs on the inside. To avoid that all too common scenario, we need a way to make sure that we can follow the plug out to keep the driver pins and springs in the Bible as we remove the core. And we do that using things called followers. These are just tubes of a solid material, some plastic, this one's 3D printed for example, some metal, they can be steel, they can be brass, they can be titanium, it doesn't matter. You buy these commercially, so these ones, for example, are from the HUK Disassembly kit that I mentioned earlier. Or you can have them 3D printed or make them out of something like wooden dowel or really anything of the right diameter. For padlock cores, you often need something with a 10mm diameter to make a follower out of. And the standard size follower needed for most locks is 12.5mm-ish or 1/4 of an inch. The process for using a follower to follow out the rear of a plug is to first make sure that the core is turned a little bit towards the clockwise or anti-clockwise position, as long as the key pins are away from the driver pins in the Bible. If you have picked this lock and there is no key in here, then what could happen is that the driver pins will drop back down into the chambers in the plug, but sometimes in the wrong position if you've partially pushed the plug out. And this is how we follow the plug out. In one hand we put the follower at the back of the plug, then just applying a tiny bit of counter pressure we slide the plug out of the body of the lock. With a lock like this with a flush rear to the plug, this is quite easy to gut. There are different considerations when you have plugs where the rears are different shapes and have little grooves and cutouts on them. When gutting locks like this, you want to make sure that you keep all of the driver pins away from where these cutouts in the back of the plug are, because what can happen is imagine if it was like that, all of the driver pins would just drop down into these cutouts on this lock, and potentially you could damage the springs and mix up all your pins. It would be a bit of a disaster. So whether you've picked this lock or you have the key, the first thing you want to do is turn the plug like we mentioned earlier, but make sure that you're not exposing the driver pins to any of the cutouts in the back of the lock. You also have grooves here where the circlips are held onto, and sometimes, especially very thin pins, ones where you have pin-in pins, they can catch in here. So not only do you need to turn this, but we want to use a shim where possible. A shim isn't really anything special, it's just a piece of slightly curved, very, very thin, flexible metal, which is used as a bit of a spacer between the plug and the Bible to ensure that the driver pins and springs don't end up getting caught in the plug or the rear of the plug, or where the circlip groove is, or anything weird like that. To use a shim, we just insert it in an open lock. Again, doesn't matter whether I have the key or it's been picked from the rear, which is why you can't use a shim when you're gutting from the front, only from when you're gutting from the rear like this. You can see that the shim is bridging the circlip groove, and when I put the follower in, just like this, it'll slide out with no problems at all, and I haven't caught any of the driver pins or springs in any of these weird cutouts or grooves in the plug. And just when you think, well, I might get away with it if I don't have shims, bear in mind that some very cheap locks have what we call skeletonized cores like this, and there are all sorts of fins and grooves by which a driver pin could easily get caught in here, and there is really very little you can do to remove the plug if it's trapped. So you could imagine this little driver pin here on the inside in one of these chambers, just catching on one of these fins and not allowing you to pull the plug out. And from the outside, you'd be like this. You'd be trying to push the follower, you're trying to pull the plug, and it won't move forwards or backwards, because all that's happened is that these driver pins have trapped themselves in these little cutouts. The reason they do this is basically to recover some of the more expensive brass and make the locks cheaper and lighter. And yes, even little padlocks sometimes have skeletonized plugs. So a good rule of thumb is, if you can shim, shim. So here I am disassembling a padlock core. You can see there's a big cutout here. I can just turn the key this way to make sure that the long bit is in line with the Bible. I can then use a shim to just give us an extra level of protection, pop my follower in like this, and just follow it out, making sure that I know where the key pins are so I don't just dump them out onto my desk. Now I've basically disassembled the lock. I've got a plug with some key pins in, and I've got a Bible with the driver pins and springs. But now what do I do? Well, first of all, I need somewhere that I can put the plug, the Bible, and the pins and springs. And a good choice would be either a pinning mat, a commercial one like this, a small pinning mat / tray like this, something like this, which is a 3D printed pinning tray. Or if you don't have the funds for anything commercial, don't have access to a 3D printer, you can just simply use a piece of card like this, and that will suffice. You will also need a way to grab the pins and the springs from the lock. I have a set of tweezers from the HUK Disassembly kit. Again, not sponsored, but I would recommend it. And I've got some commercially available pinning tweezers which have these little bends on the end, little cup-shaped pincers, which are better able to grip hold of pins. If you can't find or afford professional pinning tweezers, don't worry, you can just use any sort of stainless steel tweezers. These were literally only a couple of pounds for all of these, and you can use and modify these to be perfectly serviceable pinning tweezers, albeit they're a little bit clunky. Now we've got our pinning tray, we've got our tweezers, we can rest our plug here, and we can go to taking the pins out of the Bible. Now if you gut it this way, you can take the pins from the back or the front. I'll just go front to back, starting with pin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 in that order. So what I'd do is I'd slide the follower back with the tip of my tweezers like this, and then let that pin come up like that. Then I grab it, and then I'll put it down onto the tray. So that's driver pin 1. If I want to, I can just rotate this upside down and then gently tweeze out the spring in that chamber if I want to take that out, which I can just put that there. And I just repeat that process. I push back, I let the pin come up, I try not to let it fling itself out, grab it, put it down. Again, you can just tip out the springs if you want, and you keep going like this, and it doesn't have to take an awfully long time. Just take care, if you want to know which way up the pins were, to put them back down in the way that they were in the lock. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but some locks have pins which are in one specific way. So almost there now. Let's drive pin 5. Try and get that spring out. Might need a little bit of encouragement. There we go. Taking the key pins out of the plug is quite easy. You can put your fingers over the ones you don't want to come out and just tip out the pins in turn like this. If you do have the key, you can sometimes use it to lift the pins up and down if they're a bit stubborn, so that you can grab them with a pair of tweezers like that. Or you can just tip them out into your hand, as long as you know the order. You can then admire your pins. So that was following a plug from the rear to disassemble a lock. In this situation, which is really common for experienced lockpickers, we have a double Eurocylinder lock. We've taken away the circlip, we've picked open the lock, but we want to gut it. How on earth do we do that? If we pull the plug out from the front right now, there's nothing following from the rear, which means all the drive pins and springs will dump themselves out of the back and be a real mess, possibly even damaging the pins and springs in the process. So for this, we need some specialist tools. A pinning shoe. So this one is from the HUK Disassembly kit. It's sprung, and this will retain the driver pins in place while we remove the plug. And this one is a 3D printed one by Thomas Wenzel, I believe. And this is just a 3D printed shoe with a piece of what they call a bobby pin or a hair grip. You'll also need some front followers. Again, you can have them 3D printed, or you can buy them commercially. And this is the process. The first thing you need to do is turn the plug until the key pins, which are here at this moment in time, you need to turn them 180 degrees away from the Bible, so like this. And you may find that the driver pins drop down slightly into this gap here as you do so. So watch this, just do it gently. And I just heard some clicks. The driver pins are in there, and it sometimes can stop the lock from turning any further because it feels like it's trapped, but that's okay. Then we just need a shoe like this, and I'm going to use this 3D printed one because it's perfectly serviceable. You can of course use the commercially available ones, and they just slide in like that. But what that's doing now is retaining the driver pins and springs. We need some form of pinning tray, and then we can use a hook to just pull the plug out. Of course, you can't do this if you have the key. It must be a lock which has been picked, because you won't be able to put this pinning shoe in if the key is in the plug. You can then just remove this whole plug and put it to one side. The driver pins are now all trapped underneath this bent piece of metal. You can then use your front follower to slide down into the lock, making sure that this line here, this groove, follows that bent piece of metal like that. You can then hold the front follower, pull out the shoe, and we have a follower where the pins are being retained. If we get a light down there, you can see all the driver pins are being retained by that front follower. You'll also see that there is a groove which runs down in a slight spiral on the other side, and that's what's going to allow us to access those driver pins. So we have a groove for the pinning shoe, and on the other side we have this spiral groove. Because it's easier for you to see the pins at the front, I'm going to show you how to use this tool to gut the lock from front to back. Once again, we'll need some pinning tweezers, and in this case we'll need to just hold our pinning tweezers just in place until we see the top of the first pin, just there. Then we can hold until we feel that pin pop up. Then, well, if it doesn't drop to the back, we can grab it with the tweezers, otherwise you can just tip it out. And you see now that the spring is popping up. Try to remove that, because what will end up happening is you'll catch that spring as you turn the follower around to get to the next pin. And you just keep going. You go to the next pin, you grab it like that. That's a much better one this time. You can then tap to try and get the spring out. If it doesn't want to come up, you can again turn it upside down and tap until the spring comes out. Otherwise, just leave it in place and keep going and going and going until you have gutted the lock. And gutting the key pins is just as easy as it was before. You just tip them out. You can also use things like a hook to push up on the pins if they're being a bit stubborn, maybe they're a bit greasy and you just need to grab them with a pair of tweezers or something. But yeah, you just end up tipping these out normally, and they're normally no bother at all. And there you go. The only thing is, of course, you can't use a shim because you can't put a shim in from the rear. I will very briefly mention segmented followers. I don't really like using them, but they do have a use. So, well, here's how you use them. If you picked one side of a lock, you have the key for the other side, or you can pick that side too. You can gently and very carefully move the other side of the plug away, making sure you don't dump any of the pins out of that other side, and just gently try to push the plug back just far enough to free up the cam. It can be a bit of a pain, which is why I don't like to do this. There we go. You can then use these segmented followers to essentially push out the plug from the other side. This one doesn't have the pins and springs, so we just remove them, but the idea is you put one in like this down the center, and then you would feed it through awkwardly with your finger, adding pressure to the other side like that. You can use a pick to push them in if you like, then get the next one in place, and just keep doing that process really of putting these in, feeding them in, using a bit of back pressure so you don't end up having a gap between the plug and the followers. And essentially you can follow the plug out using segmented followers. I really hate this process because it can easily go wrong, but there is a process to it. You can do it. It does work. I've used it a few times where I've needed to, and yeah, you can follow the plugs out. As you can see, I'm just pushing the plug out from the center. You still can't use a shim. It's very fiddly. It's very easy to get a gap between the plug and the segmented followers, meaning that you end up dropping pins and springs out of the plug at the same time. So it's a real pain, but you know, like I said, it can gut a lock when you don't have a front follower or another way of doing it. So there you go, that's how you use these segmented followers. I would not recommend it for noobs, I really wouldn't. So we've gutted or disassembled our lock. How do we get it back together? Well, same thing in reverse. We just put the key pins in. It does help if you have a key to make sure that you keep the bitting correct, which means that the pins do not stick up or below the shear line. This key is the correct key, so the pins should be at shear, meaning level with the plug when I put all of the pins back in. To put the driver pins and springs back in, we just need our follower again. So I start at the back, I put a spring in, and I'm just holding it there against the follower with my finger at the back. Once that spring is in place, I can then grab my pinning tweezers and the driver pin that goes into that pin chamber, push down on top of the spring with the pin, locate the driver pin into that pin chamber and trap it using the follower with a bit of pressure. Then I can push down on the pin and just advance the follower on until it covers up that pin chamber. And then all I need to do is just go from chamber to chamber, taking the driver pins in turn in the order that I took them out, in the direction that I put them, well, took them out, or they were facing to begin with, if that's important for the lock. And if you're quite good at this, you can be pretty fast at putting all of this back together. If you have a damaged spring like this, then put the damaged part down into the Bible first. And again, you grab the pin, put it on top of the spring, push it down, move the follower up to trap the pin, push down with the pinning tweezers, and now you've put all of the pins and springs back into the Bible. Grab our shim, put that in. Again, if this has been picked, then you won't have a key, so it's very important that you align the plug so that the flat part with no gaps is at the top where the Bible is, just for extra security. And then in one just gentle push, putting some back pressure on the plug so that there's no gap between the plug and the follower, you just do this. One simple slide and removed. With a lock that's been gutted with a front follower, then the process is a little bit different. You'll need to then put the follower in, and again we can start front to back just so you can see how this goes on, because it's very hard and very dark to see into the lock past the first couple of pins. So I then take the first spring, which is very long in this case, pop that into the first pin chamber, push that down, grab my first driver pin like that, push down onto this, and then for a lock that we've gutted with a front follower, putting the springs and driver pins back into the Bible is, well, it's the reverse of taking them out. We put the front follower in. I'm going to start at the front and work backwards because it's easier for you to see the first few pins because it's very dark inside there. Steady the front follower with a finger, use our pinning tweezers, grab a spring, pop it in, take a driver pin, push down and turn the front follower until it traps that pin, I think laterally, it's a right word. Then just turn it until the next pin chamber is exposed, which is about there. It can be a bit tricky and you want to make sure that you don't let the pins in front of where you're putting the drive pins back in pop up. So just be careful, turn, trap, next spring, and just keep going backwards and backwards and backwards until all the pin chambers are full. The last spring and pin can be very hard to put back in, so just go very careful here. You will then turn the follower until you see the groove, you can put the pinning shoe down. Then you can gently hold the pinning shoe and remove the front follower. You can then populate the pin chambers of the plug in order of the way that you took them out. And again, if you have the key, you can just test to make sure that they are all going to be at shear. I'm going to put my finger over the top so they don't all jump out, and you can see that they are in the correct position. I will, however, need to remove the key before I put the plug back in, because it needs to go over this pinning shoe and just go straight down like that. So turn the cam until it snaps like that. It should be opposite to where you think it should be, which is down here, because this plug will turn and the cam will turn with it. Remove the shoe. Then you'll need a pick to push down all of the little driver pins and just turn like that. Then using a finger, turn the cam all the way around until the driver pins shoot up into the key pin chambers, locking the lock back up. You can then push on the last circlip, either with your fingers if you're able to do so, or with anything flat and firm like that. And of course, reassembling your little padlock cores is just as easy. Just make sure that you have a shim in place, you have your key pins and driver pins all in place, push that in, remove the follower and the shim. That should lock back up, and then you can put the little circlip back on the back as well to keep it all secure. And again, you can either use your fingers or a tool to put that back on. So there you go, a little guide on how to disassemble and reassemble common lock types. I hope you found that interesting. If you did, leave a like. If you have any comments about this, anything you think I did wrong or I missed out, put them in the comments below. I do read them all, reply to as many as I can. If you haven't subscribed and you think I've deserved your subscription, then please subscribe. It really helps me out. And of course, stay safe, happy picking, and I'll see you all next time.